Oh, okay. Who did that? Oh, okay.
Although those are buildings, but that's east of us. Well, we got more coming, so I'll encourage them to come up to the front. How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
All right. Yeah, good to see you. Yeah. You guys with the chairs can come forward, right? Because you're going to be sitting there.
Yes. That should be warm. Yeah.
Because everybody had kind of gotten over there.
Yeah, which was a good idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, what did he do?
I think it was pretty irresponsible
I thought so.
to die over here. He's thinking about himself.
Exactly.
Did you say blue hairs?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, that's us.
It's going to make some noise. Yeah.
Hi, Jay. Good. Yeah. At least I think it is.
They're in the way.
Oh, no, I don't.
No, I mean the slides.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but kind of need it.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, great to have this turnout. Welcome everyone, welcome friends and cousins. It's great to see everybody here today. Many of you have traveled a great distance to be here, and many in spite of difficult health problems too. Welcome. It was about a year ago I met my third cousin Glenn, and we shared our mutual interest in family history. As a reenactor, I was beyond excited to discover that our third great-grandfather was a veteran of the War of 1812. I was also aware of the graveside recognition program that was in progress since 2012 and the bicentennial of the war. And this has led me to push this idea forward, and I'm glad that Glenn was on board with it. It is a great honor for me to have a part in recognizing Henry's service in the early history of our country. I'd like to present Kim Hutchin from the municipality of Brockton now. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. My name is Kim Hutchin. I'm a councillor with the municipality, and on behalf of Mayor Peabody and the municipality of Brockton, I welcome you all. I think it's awesome that we're recognizing Henry, and I personally would like to think he's up there watching us all today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kim. Appreciate you being here. And for the municipality letting us dig holes in the cemetery. We really appreciate that too. We didn't have to sneak in here in this cover of darkness to do that. All right, so you may have a pamphlet that says the order of service. We're already on number 3, so those of you who are having a problem with the sun, just hang on. I'm going to, in the pamphlet that you've got received today, on coming here, there's a bullet listing of things that Henry did. He was private, Henry Bulbeck, 2nd Battalion, 8th Regiment of Foot, they were called. Those bullets describe the life of an adventuresome, tough man who became a soldier in King George III's British Army. And he later grew into a yeoman, or we would call that a farmer, in the wilds of Upper Canada. What I'd like to do right now is give you some context about Henry Bulbeck's life, what shaped his journey, and perhaps why he ended up in this beautiful country we now call Bruce County, Ontario, Canada. So North Mundham, Henry's birthplace, is in one of the southerly counties of England. It lies directly across the English Channel from France. Young Henry must have heard at home about the changing nature of the French nation, first as a monarchy, then a republic, and then with an emperor named Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte. Henry was a teenager by 1801, and he was caught up in the effort by the British government to raise militias in the southern counties for defense against the French. It's something we've been doing for hundreds of years. Lists of eligible men between the age of 15 and 60 were drawn up in about 1803. Henry Bulbeck's name must have been one of the lists. He must have been on the list for Chichester, actually. 1 year later, 300,000 men were on the coast of England ready to repel France's Grand Army, as it was called. He spent 5 long years with the Sussex militia, walking up and down the coast of England, as far north as Newcastle, so that's several hundred miles north of London. This militia group walked over 1,500 kilometers in the 5 years that Henry was in the militia. The days and nights were spent in barracks, and the main activities were likely guard duties and monitoring the coast in case of a French invasion of England. He was paid £1 a day, the rate for a common laborer, and the British Army also paid for perhaps 1 or 2 beers a day. So that made things a little bit easier, hopefully, at least after the second beer. At the end of that decade, the British Army apparently needed more recruits for their regular army. Their empire spanned the globe. It never set on the British Empire. The sun never set on the British Empire. And it was constantly in danger from other sea powers. At that time, 1809, they were actively at war with France. One of the sources of new army recruits was the militias that Henry was in. These men had had experience with army life. They knew how to obey commands. They knew how to walk. And they were likely looking for more adventure than they had got, walking around the county looking for French folks. When Henry signed up with the army, 1809, Britain was at war in Portugal, with about 15,000 troops on the peninsula fighting Napoleon. 1 year later, Britain and her allies were still fighting the French in Portugal, but now with 50,000 soldiers against 65,000 French. So they increased greatly, very, very fast. Fortunately for us as his descendants, Henry and his comrades of the 2nd Battalion were heading for the New World, not for Portugal. The upstart Americans, were signaling their dissatisfaction with the British Navy's action against the American ships. So that's what we think caused the War of 1812. Henry was going to get his adventure. He was also getting 7 weeks on a British Navy vessel on his way to the colony of Nova Scotia between August the 6th and September 24th, 1810. 7 weeks on a wooden boat. If you're seasick like me, that's not a good thing. The 5 years that Henry initially spent in North America was very much shaped by the relations between Britain and her former United Colonies of North America that we now know as the U.S. Our information about Henry and the 2nd Battalion comes from pay records. That's the only thing that is left of their time. Privates like Henry were paid every 3 months. On March 24th, June 24th, September 24th, and 1 day before Christmas, December 24th. These records are housed in the National Archives in London, England, and you have to go and you have to visit there personally, or you have to hire somebody to go there on your behalf if you want to get those informations. I'm guessing that Henry's time in Halifax was spent mostly in helping guard Halifax's harbour, very important, and the Citadel Hill. If you've ever been to Halifax, there's a big citadel or a fort up on top of the hill, up from the harbour. There was also a lot of privateer activity in that area, leading up to the War of 1812, with local residents building or buying boats so they could go seize American vessels on the high seas. When Henry's 2nd Battalion moved to St. John, colony of New Brunswick, just across the Bay of Fundy, in 1813 there was over a dozen structures there that made up the St. John Harbour Defense Network. And St. John's located at the mouth of the 450-mile-long St. John River and controls access to a large lumbering and agricultural resource area. So it's a very important city. In fact, it was more important than Halifax at that time. Our guess is that Henry's 2nd Battalion was guarding the harbour and the roads against land-based invasion from Maine to the west by the U.S. forces. So while guarding forts and harbors and access road could get pretty boring if there's no attacks, the year 1814 proved to be very different. A call was received early that year from, not a call on the telephone, but like a courier or something, was received from General Prevost, who was the Governor General, to head to Fort Chambly, south of Montreal, Lower Canada. What followed was a winter odyssey. 6 companies of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Regiment made their way along what is now Trans-Canada Highway from St. John to Montreal, basically, and to the fort, a distance of 900 kilometers. On snowshoes, in February. Their march took 40 days. In some ways, that was the testing of these gentlemen, who were not used to Canadian winters by any means. 6 months later, the 2nd Battalion was most likely in the United States as part of the unsuccessful September 1814 attack on Plattsburgh, New York. That's in Lake Champlain. My guess is that Henry was wounded there, which led to his later hospital stays in Montreal for about 60 days in 1815. So he was not able to go back to England with his battalion. He had to go later. So when he arrived back in Portsmouth, October 1815, he was transferred to the 1st Battalion garrison, and then he was discharged in early 1816. Well, that was a long time since he signed up with the Sussex Militia, right? 1804 to 1816. So I was, I shouldn't do this ad lib, but I think that's 12 years. So why then, this is the second part of this, why then did Henry, his new bride Jane, and their son John embark on what was Henry's 3rd trip to Canada? Once from England in 1810, once from the US in Lake Champlain, 1814, and then the 3rd time in 1818. Just 2 years after he got married. Remember, it's 7 weeks on a wooden boat, and if you're seasick, that seems like forever. Was farming in North Mundham, Sussex, that bad? Henry was now a wounded veteran, age 30. His wife was 31, their son was 2. As the oldest of 5, Henry would have inherited the farm if there was a farm. In my early 30s, I was trying to see the world. So I'm thinking, that's the best guess I have, is that Henry wanted to see Upper Canada. He wanted to get some free land as a veteran of the War of 1812. He wanted to blaze his own trail, literally, and become part of an informal force that was set up to guard against a future expansionist force from across Lake Ontario from New York State. So he did come. He was the only person from the 8th Regiment to get land at the Richmond military settlement in Goulburn near Ottawa. By 1822 he owned that land, and 10 years later sold that and moved south to Marlborough Township, which is right near where the Rideau Canal is today. But the last mystery we have is, why did he then pull up stakes in the 1850s and move here to Brant Township? When he made the request in May 1854 for what is called Lot 24 Concession A, that's just across the main street in Cargill, just east of this road, so just not very far from here, he was 66 years old when he asked to take that land over. What was he thinking? None of his children were here yet. So it wasn't that he was wanting to babysit his grandkids more. And the other Henry, the Henry Cargill from this area that it's named after, he wouldn't arrive in the area until 1871. The year he bought part of Greenock Swamp for $4.66 an acre. Henry Cargill did that. So it wasn't that Henry Bulbeck wanted to be part of a new lumbering operation or something. When I think about it, I think it was probably his quest for one last adventure. The Durham Road had been surveyed a few years before. It had been built in 1850. The Elora Road that just goes east of here was built in 1851. And that would have been the way that Henry and Jane came to this area in 1854. And this area in those days was called Yokosipi. Some of you might have heard that term before if you're living in this area. That was a corruption of the Ojibwe Cherokee word Atayokosipi, which means drowned lands river. I think in reference to the Greenock Swamp that is just east of us, or west of us here. Sadly, Henry did not see his last adventure mature into success. My guess is that his son Henry James and wife Ann Nelson Bulbeck arrived here in Yokosipi in late 1856. They had their son John Albert, which some of you are descended from. John Albert was born in Brant Township in January 1857. Perhaps Henry James and his father Henry got to spend some time together, talking about the past and planning for their family's futures together before the elder Henry passed away. So the last part of this is almost 163 years has passed since Henry Bulbeck was buried here in this Cargill's Holy Trinity Anglican Cemetery. For many of those years he was forgotten. His surname went through many spelling variations: Bulbeck, Bulbeck, Belbeck, 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 Belbick, Belback. You might have heard some of those. In my generation, the baby boomers, knew nothing of his story. I talked to a gentleman in yellow. Yes, that gentleman over there. He remembers when this was totally covered by lilacs thicker than those behind you. It was amazing. So nobody could even find his grave. The cemetery was deconsecrated by the Anglican Church in 1972, so they had given up normal ownership, I think, of this cemetery. But on April 11th, 1991, my cousin Sandra Belbeck Lamontagne from Rockland, Saskatchewan, started searching for her grandfather Belbeck's parents. She wanted to know who her grandpa was coming from. She soon found that our cousin David Belbeck in Ontario, Bob Cajun I think was where he grew up, had already started the same sort of search in 1982. They made a good team. Samra would look up references, Dave would run down to the Ontario Records place and photocopy them. And our Ed Maxwell, yes, here in Paisley, found out about Henry Bulbeck from Kees Vanderplas's research here and the website Tall Trees, Deep Roots. And Ed was, as he mentioned, familiar with a recognition program that was set up to help us remember veterans from the War of 1812. When my dad died in 1997, I inherited all his notes about his informal family research over the years. I think he got a lot of free dinners researching all that stuff. I can remember going to people's places I had barely heard of and ending up having dinner with him while he was doing research about his family. So after I got those records and thousands of Canadian dollars and thousands of British pounds later and 22 years of research later, here we are today. If we hadn't done the research, we wouldn't have been able to prove he was in the British Army. We wouldn't have been able to get the plaque and we wouldn't have this ceremony. And without the work of Sandra and David and Ed, we would definitely not be able to prove that Henry was a veteran of the War of 1812, and there wouldn't be any plaque to unveil here in a minute. Now, thanks to Facebook, 49 of us are now connecting regularly on our phones. We just welcomed Alan Sinclair yesterday and another cousin today who couldn't be here from Ottawa. And we can talk to each other on our phones, although some of us have never met each other. They are looking anxiously to see some pictures from the ceremony, though. A lot of them said, please send us some pictures and even videos. So we have a couple of videos going as well, I think. According to a family file built partly from Dave's and Sandra's computer programs, we know that Henry and Jane are ancestors to over 800 families, numbering 2,300 individuals. And those are only the ones we know about. It's very exciting to be part of this ceremony to officially recognize the contribution that our ancestor Henry Bulbeck of North Mundham, Sussex, England made to the shaping of North America as we know it today, even if the ceremony is 162 years too late. Thank you.
After Henry's passing in 1856, the Bulbeck family flourished in the Cargill and Ellengowan area. Henry James had 9 children, several of whom took up land in Brant and Greenock Township, in the Brant and Greenock Township area. My great-grandfather, John Albert, would farm just up the road, up Highway 3, across from the grain dryers that you see today. If you turn right at the intersection on the 12th of Brant, you'll go past the farms of Edmund and Joseph Bulbeck as well, which was occupied, the Joseph Bulbeck farm was occupied by W.H. Bulbeck and Gordon Bulbeck in turn, and is now the Eden Springs Eco Camp. So it's possible to put up a tent and stroll around the old farm today. Many of the others of the family moved to the Canadian West, to Michigan, South Dakota, and beyond. Henry James' daughter Mary Ann married Archie Campbell from Walkerton. Some of their descendants still managed to return to Teeswater for the Old Boys reunion. Although the Bulbeck name is somewhat